This video is going to talk about how individuals living in social groups can influence each other's evolution in positive and negative ways. And it'll give an introduction to both selfish behaviors and altruistic behaviors. Let's start our discussion of the evolution of social behavior by looking at the possible pairwise interactions. When you live with a group of other individuals, there are a variety of ways that you can influence each other's evolution. So let's just take American crows, for example. In some regards, they can be very aggressive to individuals of their own species and defend territories so that only the family unit can have access to those resources, and they're very aggressive and selfish with regard to access to those resources against other conspecifics. But sometimes individuals on neighboring territories may drop that aggressive behavior and cooperate to, say, drive off some common threat. And then we'll even talk about the rare circumstances in which individuals will forego breeding themselves, but will instead take care of the nestlings associated with other breeders. So we're going to go through this chart here. The first interaction that we're going to look at is selfish behavior. And selfish behaviors are easily the most likely to evolve in evolution because individuals, again, are going to do what's best to achieve their evolutionary goal. Remember, fitness is a competitive venture. And if you can do something to increase your fitness and at the same time decrease competitors' fitness, those are the types of traits that are likely to spread generation to generation and drive the evolution of a species. Well, what about cooperative behaviors? Cooperative behaviors can be fairly common because by definition, in a cooperative venture, there's mutual benefit. So individuals are doing really what's best in their best interest to maximize their evolutionary goal, to maximize their fitness. And if it just so happens to help the fitness of other individuals, then that can evolve as well. What about this interaction, which we call spiteful behavior? A situation in which you do something to hurt someone else's fitness, even though it hurts your fitness. Well, this is not evolutionarily stable. There really are no clear natural examples of spiteful behavior, because if you think about it, how would a spiteful gene, an allele at some locus, that causes that behavior get passed on? You're specifically doing something to hurt some other individual's fitness, but it also hurts your fitness. So it hurts the chances that that very specific gene for that behavior is even going to make it into the next generation. So this is not evolutionarily a stable behavior. And at first glance, this also appears to be something that shouldn't evolve. Altruism. Altruism is a situation in which you do something to help some other individual's fitness, but at a cost to your fitness. It turns out that under the right circumstances, altruistic behaviors can spread in a population. But we're going to see that this really depends on how we define fitness. So we have to introduce a new concept called inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness is defined as your direct fitness plus fitness you can derive from what's called the indirect component. Now, direct fitness is pretty much how I've been describing fitness throughout the semester. It's basically reproduction of offspring. The greater number of offspring you produce, the more your fitness. That's how I've been describing. But in inclusive fitness terms, that's just the component of direct fitness. Indirect fitness is the idea that you can also gain fitness by increasing the reproductive capacity of offspring of closely related individuals. If you can do something due to your actions that greatly increase the reproductive success of close relatives, well, you're passing on more copies of your genes. Another way of looking at this, if you can save the life of a number of individuals that are closely related that would have died, as long as those number of genes are greater than the 100% of genes that you share with yourself, that would also be a benefit from the indirect fitness. So let me make it clear. The way I've been trying to be careful talking about fitness, the goal of all organisms is to maximize the number of copy of genes you pass on to the next generation. And see, here are just two ways that you can do that. You can do it directly by the production of offspring, but there's another route to gaining fitness, in the indirect route. Because by definition, close relatives share a high proportion of the same genes that you do. So if you increase their reproductive success, indirectly you're increasing your reproductive success as well. You're increasing your fitness. So let's say we've got a population of birds in which two individuals, if they bred, typically could produce 2 offspring. But if we have a situation like this where an altruist helps them in their reproductive effort, they can produce maybe 5 offspring. It turns out under certain circumstances, from the altruist point of view, that's actually better for them to raise the young of other individuals if they're closely related, if they can significantly increase their reproductive success. That's actually the better route to maximizing your fitness than breeding yourself. So again, let me just make it clear. Why does helping relatives raise extra young increase your fitness? Well, again, the definition of being a relative is that you share a certain percentage of the same genes. And the closer that relationship, the more genes you share in common. And again, the goal of all organisms is to pass on as many copies of your genes into future generations as possible. So in most cases, we do think about the best way of achieving your evolutionary goal is through direct fitness. But when might the indirect component of fitness be enough that the altruistic tendencies, those behaviors, will exist in a population and those genes will spread? Well, here's a formula called Hamilton's rule, and it's a relatively simple formula that explains the circumstances in which altruistic genes would spread. The first thing we have to look at is what is the potential benefit for this altruistic behavior? And that will be represented by B. B is the number of extra individuals that are produced given that you helped, that you provided the altruistic behavior. But the real key here in doing these calculations is it's the extra individuals above and beyond what the individuals you're helping could have done on their own. Now you're going to take this number and do a correction factor that's associated with the coefficient of relatedness. This is the relationship between the altruist and these extra offspring that are produced. So that's going to modify the benefits associated with the altruistic behavior. The cost of the behavior is simply the number of gene copies that you could have done if you would have reproduced. So if you forego reproduction, what are you giving up? That's the cost. And so Hamilton's rule is abbreviated as B times R minus C. So the benefit, the B, is devalued depending on the relatedness of the extra individuals you reproduce. And as long as that quantity is greater than the cost, C, then that altruistic gene should evolve. So another way of putting it, are the benefits of the altruistic behavior downgraded by the relatedness to those recipients greater than the cost of the behavior? And the cost of the behavior in this case is not reproducing on your own. If that's the case, altruistic behavior is your better route to maximizing fitness. So a key issue associated with the evolution of altruistic behavior is the relatedness of the individuals you're helping. So we have to get a good understanding of how you can calculate R, or get a rough understanding at least of what R represents. So let's first just talk about when you have direct reproduction, where a parent produces an offspring and it's actually a reproducing organism. Remember, one of the aspects of meiosis is you're producing gametes that have only half of your DNA. So you're related to your offspring by a half. Well, let's think about how your relatedness might be associated with other individuals. Well, with full siblings, it's the same thing. You share half of your DNA with your full siblings. So if you can raise extra full brothers and sisters, it's really equivalent to like you're producing offspring. When you get into more distantly related individuals, there's a smaller fraction of genes shared. So half siblings, you have to half the full sibling, so it'd be a quarter. If you skip a generation, grandparents to grandchild, it's a quarter. Aunts and uncles to their nieces and nephews, it's a quarter. And then you start getting into more distant things like first cousins, and then it's only an eighth. And here's just kind of some of the logic associated with that. So why are half siblings a quarter? Well, here, if you're the actor, if you're the altruistic individual, and you say you're going to help mom and dad raise other siblings, but you only have one shared parent, so this is really a half sibling. So maybe this is dad, and dad's got another mate, and so mom is unrelated. Your relationship to dad is a half. Remember, parent offspring. And then here we have the parent offspring, which again is a half. So a half times a half is a quarter. Now let's look at this and bring it down here. This is the same thing, right? So again, that's just the relationship through dad. But if it's a full sibling now that we're dealing with, that means we've got mom in the picture. the mom that was the mom of this individual. So again, you've got this individual that's you, the altruist, related to mom by a half, and then mom is related to this sibling by a half. So we get this quarter plus this quarter, and now we have a half. And here's just showing you the route to cousins. So here you're related to mom or dad by a half, and then mom and dad are related to their brothers or sisters by half, which are your aunts or uncles, and then their offspring are related to them by half. So it's a half times a half, which is a quarter, times a half, which is an eighth. So let's give some examples and plug some numbers into Hamilton's rule to give you a better sense for what it would take for an altruistic allele to evolve. Let's say we have a population of organisms in which the average fitness that you could reasonably assume is 2 offspring. So that's one set of genes. And that would be associated with the potential costs if you don't breed. Now let's assume that if you do serve as an altruist and you're going to produce full offspring of the breeders that you're helping, so you're helping mom and dad, you have to produce 3 extra siblings for this strategy to pay off. So let's plug the numbers into Hamilton's rule. So this is the benefit. Remember, the benefit is the number of extra offspring that you're helping mom and dad produce. So if they could have produced 2 on their own, and you add 3 to that, it's a total of 5. But you can't count the original 2 because mom and dad could have done that on their own. So remember, the B here is the number of extra offspring that are produced. Again, if you are helping mom and dad, though, you're multiplying this by the relatedness you have to those individuals, which is 0.5. So 3 times 0.5 is 1.5 minus 1. So you're getting 0.5 extra sets of genes with your altruistic behavior than you would have been able to do on your own because the cost is 1. You would have been able to produce 2 offspring, each of which are half related to you, so 1 set of genes. And graphically, let me just kind of show you what that would look like. So if mom and dad could have done this, and if you would have bred, assuming that you would have had equal reproductive success, maybe you could have done that too. Then if you instead help mom and dad raise the young, and you can pull off 5 individuals, again, these individuals right here you can't count. Mom and dad could have done these on their own. These 2 basically are equivalent to what you could have done on your own. So at this point, it would be break even, whether you reproduced by yourself, independently through direct fitness, or in this case, if you've produced mom and dad produce 4, then you would have been at the break even point. But now, if you do help mom and dad raise 5 young, this is the individual that makes altruistic behavior beneficial, the best route for your fitness. And so if this was the typical situation, this altruistic gene would evolve in this population and spread. Now, clearly in this situation, if you were the breeders, you're having the highest fitness, right? So if you're able to somehow convince individuals to serve as your helper in this situation, and generally we call these individuals these altruist helpers, then you're getting far more fitness, right? So you're getting 2.5 copies of your genes passed on. So if you can't convince helpers to help you and you can only produce 2, you'd be better off actually serving as a helper and helping full relatives, full mom and dad, raise siblings. So let's change the numbers a little bit. Let's say now that the average fitness is only 1 individual that you'd be able to produce on average. So really, every time you reproduce, you can only expect to pass on half of your genes. Now let's assume that there's an altruist that's helping dad, but mom had died, and so dad's got a new female that he's mated with. You would still need to produce 3 extra half-siblings in this situation, 3 extra offspring. And the reason for that is, yes, the cost isn't as high, right? It's 1 here versus in the last example it was 2. But in the last example, you're producing full siblings. Now you're just producing half-siblings. So the math down here has changed. You still need to produce 3 extra, but instead of that being multiplied by 0.5, it's 0.25. That's what it would take to get you past the 0.5. But now the fitness advantages of altruism isn't as high. It's still better than direct fitness options if you have to breed on your own and don't have your own helper. But if you do help dad with stepmom, you're only going to be getting 0.25 sets of genes through your altruistic behavior. And again, just to kind of show you that if this is what you could have done and this is what dad and stepmom could have done, but with your help, now they're producing, instead of 5, you're just producing 4. But you're producing the 3 extra. Again, you couldn't count this individual because they could have produced this on their own. These 2 individuals now count as this single individual you could have produced on your own. You may be thinking, wait a minute. In the last case, it was 2 for 2. But remember, those were full sibs. These are only half sibs, so they're not related by half. This individual, if you could have produced them on your own, was related to you by 0.5. Each of these individuals is only related to you by 0.25. So that's the break-even point here, 3 individuals in the situation. More than 3 individuals, though, total. So 3 extra individuals. This is the individual that makes the altruistic behavior beneficial, but not quite as beneficial as the last example. But it would still evolve in this context. It's still the adapted behavior. Now, when we talk about the evolution of behaviors that are associated with altruistic behaviors, we call that a special type of natural selection called kin selection. Selection for genes that increase your fitness via the indirect route of fitness. So let's give some examples. Red squirrels will sometimes adopt individual pups that have been abandoned for some reason. So for typically, if mom dies. If mom dies and these young are going to die on their own unless they're adopted by another individual, sometimes that does occur. If they don't have any relatives nearby, they're toast. They're not going to make it. They're never going to be adoptive if there isn't a relative nearby. If there is a relative nearby, though, it depends on a couple of things. First, does she have enough milk to share with these other pups? So that's going to depend on the number of offspring that she has. So what is the cost to her own young? Because that could potentially give her direct fitness losses. But then also, what does she have to gain? What is the relatedness of these pups that need to be adopted? And so what is her potential indirect fitness gains? And so this graph down here kind of shows you the different options. So on the x-axis is the mother's litter size, the number that she originally had of her own young. And as you have more and more young, it's more costly. So there's energetic expenditures associated with production of more independent young. Now let's look at the fitness costs or benefits associated with the indirect fitness benefits. If you have 4 young, it's just barely okay if you adopt an individual pup that's really close related. So at the relatedness of, on average in this population, 0.368. But that's about as close as you're going to get. Now, if you come over here, if you're only talking about, relatedness of the pup is 0.25 to you, you're only going to do that in this one example if you're somewhere along in this trajectory. So probably not past 3. In this case, in this study, they only found it associated with individuals that were didn't have their own pups were lost for some reason due to predation or death of some other reason. And here's the relatedness that would be associated with adoption only if you had 2 or fewer young. So if you're talking about cousins here, the 1/8, you're not going to adopt them if you have more than 2 of your own offspring. It's just that line is just too steep there. Here we have situations where they were available, but they just weren't adopted because the potential stepmother already had 3, and it was just going to be too costly. Well, now let's talk about an example where we're not talking about the production of extra young, but saving a certain number of relatives from death. So here's an example of black-tailed prairie dogs. They live in these large groups, and it's usually a fairly large number of closely related females and unrelated male breeders that come into the population. And what we see is when a predator approaches the colony, some individuals will give alarm calls. And there's the potential that this increases the likelihood that the signaling individual, the individual giving the alarm call, like in this photograph right here, is going to be more prone to being killed by this predator. But the idea is if they sacrifice their life and save the lives of multiple close related individuals, this is still the best way that they're saving copies of their genes. And sure enough, individuals are more likely to call when they're surrounded by close relatives. So here we have males versus females on the x-axis, and the percentage of simulated badger attacks in which they gave alarm calls. And if they didn't have kin nearby, both males and females were less likely to give these alarm calls. They're much more likely to give these alarm calls when they're surrounded by close kin. Now, this is a pretty cool study. They've done similar things like this in multiple cases. I know some of the earlier studies, how they simulated a badger attack is they took a taxidermied specimen of a badger and they put it on a wooden cart and they drug it through the colony with a rope. I think some more recent studies have actually mounted this on a radio-controlled car, and they kind of basically just drove the badger into the colony. So the first example here was just talking about how they behave if they have kin versus non-kin nearby. Well, do they treat parents and full siblings differently than offspring? Because remember, offspring, your direct offspring, have the same relatedness that you have to your parents and your full siblings. And it turns out that both males and females don't treat them differently. They're just as likely to call for their own offspring versus their parents or their full siblings, both males and females. There's no significant difference between these columns for males and females. Now remember, when we talked about inbreeding avoidance, one of the things that mammals do is males tend to disperse farther than females. Females tend to stay closer to the area in which they were raised. So that means a dispersing male at different times of his life is going to have a different probability of having close relatives nearby. So when a male is young and he's still living in the birth coterie, the coterie is the colony in which he was born, so that he has parents and siblings nearby and some potentially other kin, each of these lines and each of these colored dots refers to a specific individual at different life phases. And you see that in all cases, these males, now they range from being kind of scaredy cats to the real brave individual here, but they all share some degree of likelihood of giving some alarm call. But once they leave the area in which they were born, the home coteries, and they move into a new coterie to try to establish themselves as breeders, before they become breeders, now they're complete strangers. They don't have any close relatives nearby. And look at what they do. They all have decreased their likelihood of giving these calls. They're not being altruistic. They are being selfish. They're letting other individuals alert the coterie that something's wrong. But if they live there long enough that they're able to breed in these coteries, now they resume their behaviors. Again, some individuals have personalities that make them braver than others, but you see in all cases an increase in the likelihood that they're going to call again. Now, this one individual lived long enough to be evicted by another group of males from the coterie and was excluded. And then when he moved to another colony with unrelated individuals, again, he completely lowered his probability of giving these alarm calls. So this is exactly what you would expect. If this is an altruistic behavior, you should only do it when you have the potential to help close relatives, which indirectly helps you. Well, the first theoretical example I was giving you in birds was really a behavior called cooperative breeding. Cooperative breeding is one of the areas that I've done a lot of research on. And here's an example of cooperative breeding in white-fronted bee-eaters. Helper individuals serve as altruists. They forego breeding to help others raise young in the colony. And they really are beneficial to the individuals that they help. They decrease nestling starvation, they bring more food, and they bring food more regularly to the nest in which they're helping. But what we see is helpers are much more likely to help close relatives. And in this way, it increases the individuals they're helping, their direct fitness, but it also helps the indirect fitness of the helpers. So if we look over here, the non-breeding helpers, who do they help in the population? They're much more likely to help their mom and dad than they are to in-laws. Sometimes individuals will go off and recruit a mate and try to breed, and if their nest fails and they go back to become a helper, they could either go with their mate to their in-laws and help, versus they can go to their own relatives. Very rarely do they go to their in-laws. This would typically only occur if it's the female mated to the male and the male is kind of directing the behavior of where to go to, and they have an established mate bond, or if one of the individual's parents have died and they will go and help the in-law. So this indicates that, yeah, it looks like they're probably picking typically to help close relatives. And the degree of that relatedness also is what we would expect given Hamilton's rule. This blue line shows you the expected number of individuals, or the probability that an individual would help each of these classes of relatedness based upon their just general availability in the population. In general, you don't have a lot of close relatives that are related to you by 0.5 in the population. But if you serve as a helper, that's the category you're most likely to help. Helping mom or dad with a step parent, that's the next closest one. And that tends to happen a little bit more, but you're still doing it above and beyond expected based upon the just general availability of individuals of that degree of relatedness in the population. Now, when we get over here, especially, let's go way over here. Now we're talking about just completely unrelated individuals. Rarely do you see them helping in those circumstances, and usually, again, it's an in-law situation. You're helping at your mate's relatives. But if you just were randomly going to help an individual in the population, yeah, most individuals in the population are unrelated to you, and you just don't do that very often. So this is exactly what you would expect. The behavior is directed to closer related individuals because that's where you're going to get the most potential indirect fitness gains. And this is just a figure showing that, yes, indeed, helpers do increase nesting success, which helps both the breeders, but it provides a mechanism for helpers to increase their fitness through the indirect fitness component. So typically, just pairs alone can't produce very many offspring on average. So most of the time, they're not having success at all. So on average, they get less than one fledgling. What about when there's one helper there? Well, there's a significant increase in fitness. You add 2 helpers, there's even greater fitness. And in one case, there were 4 helpers, a group size of 6. And look, we continue to see an increase in the number fledged. These numbers above each of those is the number of cases in which these group sizes were registered. So in this study, 94 of the breeding individuals were just pairs. Well, let's give one more example of how kin selection could lead to differential behaviors relative to the availability of kin and non-kin in a population. In spadefoot toads, tadpoles can develop in one of 2 morphologies. They show some phenotypic plasticity. If there's enough food around, they typically develop as herbivorous tadpoles, just feeding on algae and other aquatic vegetation. If, however, there's not enough food to go around and the population is really dense, at one stage they will develop into a cannibalistic form, or a certain percentage of individuals will. And this means that they're going to eat other animals, including other spadefoot toads. And when experimentally raised in a situation where there's an equal availability of tadpoles of the same age that are related to you and non-related to you, if they're raised in a situation where food is not really common and they develop into the cannibalistic forms, you don't see individuals eating other individuals at random. They preferentially eat individuals that are not their relatives. They're avoiding eating their kin. So they only ate their kin about 20% of the time. So they're more likely to eat non-related individuals than related individuals. The next video is going to continue our discussion of altruistic behaviors, but ratchet it up a little bit and talk about a specific type of social behavior called eusociality.